It gives me very great pleasure to introduce my friend, my fellow Irishman, and my former colleague, Dr. David Glass, to present the last of the lectures at today's conference. David lectures in the School of Computing and Mathematics in the University of Ulster and holds degrees in both philosophy, physics and computer science from Queen's University, Belfast. His recently published book, Atheism's New Clothes, is on display in the atrium area, and I'm delighted to ask Dr. David Glass, who organises and runs the Christian apologetics organisation Saints and Skeptics, now to present us with his lecture, which is entitled Design in Biology and Physics, Design in Nature, ?
Thank you. Thank you to Harry for his kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Cambridge for this very interesting conference. And I differ from the other speakers in that my name is not Stephen. So I feel a bit out of place here today. But anyway, my title is Design in Biology and Physics. I think in the actual program it also says Strengths and Weaknesses. I think the idea was that I would look at the strengths and weaknesses of different design arguments. I think the strengths and weaknesses instead will apply to my talk. There will certainly be weaknesses there. I hope you can also spot some strengths in it as well. What I want to do is to approach the whole question of design in nature in terms of explaining and explaining away. This has already been mentioned by one of the Stephen Mayer, this morning. And so I want to look at whether certain scientific theories, the progress of science in certain respects, explains away design. After giving a little bit of an overview, I will look at the notion of explaining away. I will do this through use of an illustration to highlight the key points. And then I'll look at 5 key questions. These are questions which I think we need to answer in order to determine whether explaining away occurs in a particular context or not. I will then apply this very briefly to fine-tuning, and then my main focus will be on evolution and design. Clearly, to cover both of those topics would be an enormous task in the time available. So really in covering them, I only intend these to be illustrative of the general approach of approaching design questions in terms of explaining away. And I'll finish up by making a very brief comparison with some points of intelligent design. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes that historically religion aspired to explain our own existence and the nature of the universe in which we find ourselves. In this role, it is now completely superseded by science. The idea really is that as science progresses, there is less and less need for God. Perhaps in the past, God provided good explanations for the universe and our existence within it and so forth, but that is no longer the case. In an earlier book, The Blind Watchmaker, he wrote that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Again, the idea seems to be that it's because of the Darwinian explanation that we no longer have any need for God. What I want to do in this talk is to, first of all, distinguish between 2 approaches that an atheist might adopt towards design arguments. This is a distinction that's made by the eminent philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, who distinguishes between Humean and Darwinian approaches. The idea in a Humean response is to identify flaws in the logic of the argument. Okay. And in order to do this, then, you can show that the argument doesn't work. You don't need an alternative explanation to be in place in order to reject design. You just need to show that the argument is flawed. In contrast, we also then have a Darwinian response. And the idea in a Darwinian response is that, well, it really isn't satisfied with this philosophical response to design. It's got to do more than just point out flaws. You need an alternative explanation to be in place. Now, it's called a Darwinian response because Darwin is the most obvious example of this, providing an alternative explanation for the complexity and diversity of life. But of course, this Darwinian response could apply in other contexts as well. Fine-tuning, for example. Here it's not Darwin who provides the alternative explanation, but a multiverse, or so the argument goes. So what I'm going to do is focus on this Darwinian approach. I'm going to assume that there is some initial plausibility to design arguments, just as Richard Dawkins does. I mean, if he can assume it, surely I can assume it too. And then look at whether alternative approaches, alternative explanations remove the need for design in these contexts. This distinction is not complete between Humean and Darwinian approaches. Nevertheless, for the purposes of this paper, it will suffice. The background to the paper that I'm presenting is really based on probability theory. I had to get Bayes' theorem in there, so you had to see an equation or two somewhere. This is the only one you might be pleased to know, depending on your background. The basic idea, well, Bayes' theorem is just a standard theorem of the probability calculus, and it's not controversial in that sense at all. But what it's often used for is for updating probabilities, for certain hypotheses, for example. So the idea basically is that over on the right-hand side here, we have P of H, the prior probability of some hypothesis. And then what we want to do is to take into account some evidence E, and then over on the left-hand side, we'll get the probability of the hypothesis once we've taken that evidence into account. In order to do that, to get from the prior to the posterior probability, we need this term. And what it really looks at is how well the hypothesis in question accounts for the evidence. So if you're not too fond of mathematical expressions like this, you might like this alternative version of it. We have the prior probability, we multiply it by the explanatory power, we see how well the hypothesis accounts for the evidence in question, and then that enables us to get the posterior probability. Just one more point about the equation. If the explanatory power is greater than 1, then the posterior probability is higher. It goes up, basically. And I think this is a very helpful way to think about evidence. It's about the impact of evidence. Well, let's get away from equations for a moment and let's take a simple example. Let's suppose that a detective is trying to solve a particular crime, and Smith is one of the suspects. But there's no hard evidence to go on here. He's a suspect, but the probability of the hypothesis that Smith is guilty is quite low to start with. Now, the detective is not going to put values on this. That's not the way most detectives work, as far as I understand. But it's the idea of the reasoning process. So we're not worried about putting precise probabilities on things. I don't think that's going to be feasible in this kind of context, either for the detective or for us. But nevertheless, it helps to structure our reasoning somewhat. So we have some prior probability. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it starts out at a probability of 0.2 down here. But then we get some evidence. A reliable witness comes forward and identifies Smith. Was it Smith? I can't remember whether it was Smith or Jones now, but let's say it was Smith at the scene of the crime. Well, the detective, at least this Bayesian detective that I'm talking about, he thinks of Bayes' theorem and he says, well, how great is the explanatory power? And the question is, well, is this the kind of evidence I would expect if Smith is indeed guilty? He says, yes, it is. To be identified at the scene of the crime, that's the kind of thing I would expect. And perhaps more critically, it's not at all the kind of thing I would expect if he is innocent. So the explanatory power is greater than 1, and so his probability goes up. It's now much more likely that Smith is indeed guilty. And this E here, let's see if I can highlight it here. This E is just now taking into account the evidence E. And so if this probability, once we've taken into account the evidence E, is greater than the prior probability, then we've got confirmation of the hypothesis. And if under other circumstances we had other evidence which lowered the probability, then we would have disconfirmation. Now the question is, once we take into account the evidence, in the case of design, does the probability go up? Now, since I'm adopting a Darwinian approach, I'm assuming there's some initial plausibility to design so that we have confirmation. But now the question is, once we have an alternative explanation, a scientific explanation of some sort, what happens then? Does it remove the confirmation of design? Well, that all sounds a little bit abstract, so let me try to illustrate this by way of an example. I arrive home from work and I go into the study. And the study is a chaotic mess. There are papers all over the floor, there are books lying all over the place. It's even more untidy than usual. The lamp has been knocked over, the chairs are all over the place as well. And immediately an hypothesis springs to mind: a burglary. Now, I go back to this diagram and I think, well, how probable is a burglary? Well, it's probably pretty low. I hope it's not 0.2. I don't think the region that I live in is that prone to burglaries. But it's pretty low to start with. But once I get the evidence, well, the explanatory power is very good. This is exactly the kind of evidence, this chaotic mess in the study, is exactly what I would expect if a burglary had taken place. So I've got confirmation of the burglary hypothesis. And these arrows, by the way, are explanatory arrows, basically. They're telling us that the burglary would explain the evidence, the untidiness. But then my wife comes into the study and she tells me that she was in earlier in the afternoon and found that my children were playing in the study. And I think, aha, now, this is also the kind of evidence that I would expect if my children were playing in the study. It's exactly the kind of thing that I would expect. I should point out, of course, that my children are very young, and this is the sort of thing I would expect them to do. Of course, you already knew my children were young, I hope. I hope that should be evident. But now that we've got this alternative explanation in place, that the children were playing in the study, what does that do to the burglary hypothesis? Well, since the children hypothesis explains all the evidence perfectly well, then there's no longer any need to appeal to the burglary. Okay? No longer any reason to believe that a burglary took place. The children hypothesis has explained away the burglary. Well, one further point that I should note here. There's no necessary conflict between the two. They could both be true. It could be that a burglary took place earlier in the day, and then when my wife and kids were out, and later on they came home, the children went into the study, left in a mess by the burglar. So the two aren't incompatible. Or my children could have been in first and the burglar could have come in when they were out later on. The two hypotheses could be true. But there's no need for two explanations when one will do. Okay? So this is a kind of example of Occam's razor. But does explaining away always occur when we find out that an alternative explanation is true? Well, let's go to scenario 2. Same scenario as before, but now there's an additional piece of evidence. When I go into the study, there's all the papers and books and lamp and chairs and so forth, but there are also these heavy drawers, which are also lying on the floor now. And it's very unlikely my children would have been able to pull out these heavy drawers. It's possible, maybe if they'd all combined their efforts, maybe they could just have done it, but it's very unlikely. Okay? Now we run the scenarios before. I come home from work, go to the study, find all this stuff lying all over the place, hypothesize that a burglary has taken place. My wife comes in, tells me the children were playing, and I think, yeah, that would account for the evidence. Does that explain away the burglary? But then I think about those heavy drawers and think, well, my children possibly could have pulled those out, but it's not all that likely. So the children, certainly to some extent, their presence in the study partially explains away the burglary, but not completely. Those heavy drawers are something that are in need of explanation. Well, let's go to the third scenario. This is the final one, you might be pleased to know. And this one has a further twist on the story. It turns out that I am extremely protective of my study, let's suppose, and I have a lock on it. And every morning, religiously, before I go out to work, I make sure I lock my study. Now, this lock is a very simple lock. It would prevent my children getting in. I know what they're capable of. So that's the purpose of the lock. But it won't prevent a burglar from getting in. No chance. So now we run the whole scenario as before. I come home from work, go into the study. We've got everything lying over the floor as before, including those heavy drawers. I think a burglary must have taken place. My wife comes in, tells me the children were playing in the study. I think that accounts for the evidence. Well, except for that heavy drawer. But then I have a further question. How did my children get in here? I always lock my study in the morning, and my wife didn't let them in, so how did they get in here? That's something that needs explained as well. And now I think, well, let's suppose a burglar had been in. He presumably wouldn't have left the door, or wouldn't have closed the door on his way out. Perhaps there are better-mannered burglars where you come from, but I don't expect that in Northern Ireland. So the burglar, if there'd been a burglary, this would explain how the children were able to get in, and it would also account for those heavy drawers. So we have some explaining away. To some extent, the presence of the children accounts for the evidence, the untidiness, and so via this negative route, we have some explaining away going on, but not very much because of the heavy drawers. Furthermore, the children hypothesis, in a sense, depends on the burglary hypothesis. And so there's a positive influence. The presence of the children in the study actually, in a sense, makes it more likely that there was a burglary. Okay, well, let's think about how this relates to our probabilities. We start out, the burglary is very improbable, then I come home, find the untidiness, and the probability goes up because of its explanatory power. But now what happens when I learn that the alternative explanation is true, that my children were playing in the study? Well, in scenario 1, this accounts for all the evidence, and so the final probability for the burglary, it's right back down. It's as low as it was to start with, maybe even lower. There's just no reason to believe in it anymore. The second scenario, we have partial explaining away because of those heavy drawers. The children hypothesis didn't account for all the evidence. The evidence was still quite unlikely, given that hypothesis. So we have some explaining away, but it's nowhere near complete explaining away. It's not right back down to its initial level. And finally, the third scenario, remember the lock, how the children were able to get in there in the first place? Well, in this case, when I discovered that the children were playing, this actually provides further confirmation of the burglary hypothesis. So this is the basic idea of explaining away. It's not obvious in a particular case whether an alternative explanation really explains away the initial hypothesis. So what I want to do is outline 5 questions that we need to ask to see if explaining away occurs in a given context. First of all, we have the initial hypothesis, HI, the alternative hypothesis, HA, and some evidence E. Now, these 5 questions are not just plucked out of the air. They're based on a sort of probabilistic analysis of explaining away, which I'm not going to go into, you'll be pleased to know. But I do want to go through the 5 questions very quickly. Question 1. Is the alternative hypothesis incompatible with the initial one? Well, if it is, then problem solved. If we know that the alternative one is true, then we know the initial one is false. It completely removes the initial one. But otherwise, even if there's no conflict by way of question 1, it still could explain away the original one. No need for 2 explanations when one will do. So we've got to ask some more questions. Question 2. How well does the alternative hypothesis account for the evidence without the help of the initial hypothesis? So here what we have is the alternative hypothesis. If it accounts for the evidence very well, then we have explaining away via this pathway 1. This lowers the probability or removes the need for the initial hypothesis. So we've got explaining away. And this is what happened in the first scenario. The discovery that the children were playing in the study explained away the initial hypothesis. But I should say that if it doesn't account for the evidence all that well, as it didn't in the second scenario because of those heavy drawers, then this weakens the ability to explain away. Question 3. Is the alternative hypothesis HA known to be true? Or how strong is the independent evidence for it? Well, again, in the scenarios I described, I knew that the alternative was true because my wife told me, and I believe what my wife says. So if she has told me this and the alternative's true, well, that helps in terms of explaining away. And this is an extremely important point. Merely coming up with some possible alternative explanation is generally not good enough for explaining away to occur. There must be some reason to think that the alternative is actually true. Question 4, we're nearly there. Does the alternative hypothesis depend on the initial one? As it did in the third scenario. Well, if that's the case, then we have a positive influence via pathway 2. So the alternative hypothesis might actually support the initial hypothesis via that pathway. And so we've got to take these two pathways into account in terms of trying to figure out whether explaining away has occurred. And finally, question 5, is the evidence taken as providing evidence for the initial hypothesis in the first place? The reason I ask this question is because if it's not, then there's nothing really to be explained away. So this one isn't so critical because I'm going to assume that. Well, that's the background. Let's apply this now to fine-tuning. This has already been discussed a bit today. So let me just mention how this would work in terms of explaining away. So the basic idea has already been described earlier by several of the speakers. We have these parameters of physics, such as the ratio of the electromagnetic and gravitational forces. And these, it turns out, are very finely tuned. If they are slightly different, life would be impossible. And this suggests design, and not just for theists, but many people find this at least a very interesting reason for belief in design. It has, to a large extent, renewed interest in the design argument. So we have the evidence to account for a universe such as ours with physical constants suitable for life. We have two hypotheses. The initial one, design, that our universe is the result of design. But now we have this alternative hypothesis, the multiverse, that our universe is only one of many. Billions of universes, possibly in some versions of it even infinite numbers of universes, as Professor Clark mentioned. So let's run through this and see if the multiverse explains away design. So question 1, are the two incompatible? Well, no. I mean, there could be a designer and a multiverse. The designer might have created a multiverse. So there's no logical incompatibility here. Question 2, how likely is it that the multiverse would result in the evidence, that is, in a universe like ours, without the help of design? Well, this is very likely. That's the whole point of a multiverse, by the way, that there's enough of them that somewhere or other you're going to get, with very high probability, a universe that's suitable for life. So in terms of question 2, it has great potential for explaining away design. Indeed, even for completely explaining it away. But the Achilles heel for the multiverse explanation, I think, is question 3. Is the multiverse hypothesis known to be true? Well, no. I think the best we could say is that it's on the scientific radar. Maybe we can't completely rule it out. Maybe there could be indirect evidence of some kind for some sort of multiverse. But that's about as far as we could go. We certainly don't have anything like the confidence in the multiverse to remove the need for design. Okay, remember the point. Merely a possible alternative is not good enough. Question 4, does the multiverse hypothesis itself depend on design? Well, arguably yes. Robin Collins has argued this, and Stephen Mayer talked about this morning a little bit, that there are various factors that are required for a multiverse to exist. We need energy to generate these multiverses. We need them to be generated with a suitable distribution over the parameters and so forth. And so he argues that, in fact, if we had a multiverse, it would itself require design, indeed fine-tuning perhaps as well. So my point is not to go into the details of these arguments, but merely to say that it's plausible to think that a multiverse itself requires design. Question 5, just to put in for completion, is it taken as evidence for design? Well, yes, it often is. So let's look at our conclusion. We have these two pathways, remember. So does a multiverse explain away design? Well, via pathway 1, we perhaps have a very slight negative influence, but basically what we can say is if we knew a multiverse were true, then this negative pathway 1 would be very strong. But we don't know it's true. We don't come anywhere close to knowing it's true. And so the explaining away via this red pathway, pathway 1, is very weak. And indeed, via the other pathway, the green one, we actually have a positive link between a multiverse and design. It might, via that pathway, actually support design. So when we take all of this into account, there's just no good reason to think that explaining away occurs, even partially in this case. Well, all this has been by way of introduction. Now we come to evolution. Let's run through our 5 questions. Is there a logical conflict between evolution and design? Now here I mean just the standard neo-Darwinian account of evolution. Well, an argument might go like this. If God exists, human life would be the result of a guided process. Premise 2, if evolution is true, humans are not the result of a guided process. 3, evolution is true. Conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. Well, let's look at the premises. Premises 1 certainly seems plausible. Premises 3, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to provide an argument for it here. I'm simply going to assume that premise 3 is true, that evolution is indeed true. Now, the point really of what I'm saying is, well, look, if evolution is true, does that explain away design? So let's grant, for the sake of the argument, that 3 is true. But what about 2? If evolution is true, humans are not the result of a guided process. Alvin Plantinga discusses this in his book Where the Conflict Really Lies. And here I think we've got to think, well, why would it show that we're not the result of a guided process? And I don't think there's any logical incompatibility here. There's no reason why God couldn't have used something like the evolutionary process. Now you might say, well, what about the role of chance? What about those random mutations? Isn't that incompatible with guidance? Well, I don't think it is. I mean, if I take a coin and toss it, what's the probability of a head? Well, it's a half. So isn't that a chance process? Well, it is at that level of description, but let's suppose that determinism is true. Then if we take all the factors into account, what's the probability of a head? Well, arguably it's either 1 or not. So, is this a chance process or not? Well, at one level it is, at one level it isn't. Now what about evolution? Well, again, the philosopher of biology, Plantinga refers to Elliot Sober again on this. He describes the random component of mutation as being a physical mechanism that there's no physical mechanism which causes the mutations because they are beneficial from an adaptive point of view. But Plantinga, it seems to me, quite correctly points out that this doesn't in any way show that God couldn't nevertheless guide the process. He could have set up the initial conditions in such a way to guarantee that the right mutations come about. He could act at a quantum level or in various other ways to guarantee his desired outcome. So it seems to me that there's no logical conflict. Now what that means is that if evolution is to explain away design, it can't do it just by merely being incompatible. It's got to do it via explaining away. And so the question is, does it achieve this? Well, perhaps there's a further logical incompatibility. Richard Dawkins. The argument from design is the only one still in regular use today. False. But let's go on down a bit further. There has probably never been a more devastating rout of popular belief by clever reasoning than Charles Darwin's destruction of the argument from design. Well, he certainly isn't one for understatement of his views. That seems a bit extreme. But how exactly would that remove the need for God? Well, it seems to me there's an argument that we find in both Dawkins and Dennett which runs something like this. Darwin demonstrated that the design argument doesn't provide any reason for belief in God. The other arguments for God also fail. Therefore, there are no good arguments for belief in God. Well, this argument has the merit of being logically valid, but that's about all we can say for it. They don't actually put it in this form for good reason, because it's pretty manifestly a poor argument. And there are basically two problems with it. First of all, the premises, and secondly, the conclusion. If we were to grant the premises, then, according to the conclusion, there are no good evidential arguments of this kind for belief in God. But Alvin Plantinga would say, well, even in the absence of evidential arguments of this kind, then that doesn't mean it's irrational to believe in God. Well, that's one approach, but let's look at the premises then. Premise 2, the other arguments for the existence of God also fail. Well, the new atheists certainly haven't shown that to be true. If you've read their discussions of these arguments, it's pretty hopeless. And even 1, well, Darwin certainly doesn't demonstrate that the design argument fails in the context of fine-tuning. So this argument really doesn't work either. Well, you might say, perhaps they're not incompatible in any logical sense, but doesn't at least remove the need for God in biology? Many people seem to think this. Philosopher of religion, Peter van Inwagen, says it is commonly held that the teleological argument has been refuted by the Darwinian account of evolution. Indeed, by the very existence of the Darwinian account, whether or not we know it to be true. And this may very well be so if we take the scope of the argument to be limited to living organisms. Now note the expression, whether or not we know it to be true. Well, given what I've already said, that should raise some alarm bells here. But here I want to make a rather controversial point. Well, perhaps it's controversial, I'm not sure. It seems to me that there's an enormous consensus about this, that evolution removes design in biology. Certainly, atheistic evolutionists believe this, and so reject design in biology. Theistic evolutionists, it seems to me, by and large, there are some exceptions, also agree with this, and so they reject, typically, design in biology. But I think also intelligent design proponents and creationists typically also argue, as far as I can see, that if evolution is true, Darwinian evolution is true, then this removes the need for design in biology. And so they reject the Darwinian account, and I want to question that. That was question 1. The two aren't necessarily incompatible. Question 2, how likely is it that humans, or similar intelligent life, we'll say, would evolve if evolution is an unguided process? So now we want to ask whether this alternative explanation, EV, which I take to be living organisms are the result of evolution, and here I'm assuming that this involves the production of life in the first place by natural means. How likely is it that this process would result in the existence of human life, or intelligent life? Well, there are two polarized views on this. Stephen Jay Gould famously defended the radical contingency view, that there are loads of extremely contingent events, like the extinction of the dinosaurs and so forth, and so if we were to rerun the tape of life on Earth, we would get an extremely different outcome. We probably wouldn't be here. In fact, we almost certainly wouldn't be here. In fact, perhaps there would be nothing other than bacteria. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Simon Conway Morris, paleobiologist here in Cambridge, who has argued that if we were to rerun the tape, we'd get something pretty similar. The evolution of humans is almost inevitable. And he depends for this argument on the notion of evolutionary convergence. But even within Morris's view, the origin of life itself is improbable as far as I understand him on this point. Well, let's take Richard Dawkins. Referring to the work of Matt Ridley, he says that the origin of the eukaryotic cell was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was the same order of improbability. It seems to me that even given Simon Conway Morris's points, there are still transitions within the history of life which would make it very improbable indeed that something like human life would ever come into existence. This seems to be the view of Richard Dawkins, and I'm inclined to go along with it. Richard Dawkins, of course, doesn't use this as an argument against evolution, and that's not my point either. It's just that it's very improbable. That is, that the development of intelligent life is very improbable. Now, the idea of appealing to these contingencies as part of a design argument, which is what I'm trying to do, is not something new. James McCosh, the 19th century philosopher, theologian, president of Princeton, appealed to contingency in the evolutionary process as well. The historian of science, John Hedley Brooke, writes that if the human race were the product of so many contingencies, then either it was a more monumental fluke than atheists had ever dreamed, or as McCosh rightly put it, the prevalence of accident could not be accidental. Question 3, is evolution known to be true? I've already dealt with that. I'm simply assuming the answer to that is yes. And question 4, does evolution depend on design? Well, here again, I'm not going into the details, but the philosopher Paul Draper argues that God would be more likely to use a special creation of some kind rather than evolution. But the key point here for the argument that I'm presenting is not whether God would be likely to use special creation, but whether evolution is more likely given design than it would be given non-design. And here I think it's very plausible to think that it's more likely given design. Because evolution requires certain laws to be in place, it requires the origin of life in the first place, and these things, it seems to me, are more likely given design. So, arguably, and this does sound odd, arguably evolution depends on design. Okay? It requires design at some level. Now, what this means is that basically we have a positive influence, arguably, via pathway 2, this green arrow. And as we've already seen, the negative influence via the first pathway is relatively weak because of the improbability of intelligent life in an evolutionary scenario without design. So the fifth question, is the existence of complex life taken as providing evidence for design in the first place? Well, I'm simply going to say that's yes. I'm not going to take time to go into the God of the gaps. So the conclusion here is that when we take these two pathways into account, then perhaps Darwinian evolution partially explains away design, but that's as good as it gets. There arguably still is considerable force, I would say, to the design argument in biology. Now here what I'm saying is not just that evolution requires order as expressed in the laws of physics or fine-tuning or something, that there is evidence for design over and above anything from the laws of physics and fine-tuning. Evidence over above those that is found in biology. Well, where does this leave us? Let me, for the remaining time then, just make a few comments about how all of this relates to intelligent design. And this is my own take on this. I'll certainly be interested in comments that others might have. What I'm saying is that granting an evolutionary account of life on Earth, that this does not explain away design. Now, what I've assumed is that the complexity of life, for example, provides initial evidence for design that is not explained away. And so what I'm doing here is presenting part of what could be considered a biological design argument. Okay. And so the question then is, how does this relate to intelligent design? Well, I've highlighted 5 points here. The first one, I think, is clear-cut. Is there biological evidence for design? Well, according to the approach that I've presented, yes, there is. And so here, there's agreement with intelligent design. We have biological evidence for it. The other 4 points that I've highlighted, it's not for me to decide whether these are essential or to what extent they're essential for intelligent design, but they seem to me to be prominent in the intelligent design literature. So we have the eliminative approach to design. I'll go through each of these very briefly. The incompatibility with Darwinian evolution, design as part of science, and number 5, silence on the identity of the designer. And in each of these 4 points, we're in agreement on the first one. And the other 4, the biological design argument arguably differs. So I'm just pointing out differences between these 2 approaches. So let's take the first one, the eliminative approach. So this is about the logic of the design inference. A very common approach adopted in the intelligent design literature is Dembski's filter. William Dembski has written extensively about this approach for inferring design. And this approach is eliminative in nature. Basically, the idea is, I don't have time to go into this in detail, nor the capability probably, but the basic idea is that we have complex specified information, and this enables us to eliminate necessity and chance and combinations of the 2 as an explanation for the origin, not for the origin of life, but for the complexity of life more generally. Having eliminated these possibilities, then we can infer design. The approach that I am adopting is a Bayesian approach, and by its very nature, it's comparative. It's not just saying that these approaches fail, but rather comparing them with design. And so here we've got to say something positive about the design hypothesis. We've got to make a positive case, not just a negative case. Now, here I've got to be careful. I mean, of course, intelligent design is saying plenty of positive things about design, but in terms at least of Dembski's filter, this is not essential to the logic of intelligent design. And I think there are some problems with this eliminative approach. It's based on an approach to hypothesis testing that I think is at least questionable. Questionable whether we can ever completely eliminate a hypothesis. I think this traditional approach based on Fisher's work was not intended as a general approach to inductive reasoning. But as I said, we don't have time to go into the details of this. What it does tell us is that either we can eliminate it or it's very, very improbable. And even if we can do that, it doesn't tell us what we should believe in its place. Now, with the filter, the idea is that we eliminate all alternative hypotheses. And that seems to me to be very difficult. Difficult and unnecessary. I mean, this is my claim here, that it's unnecessary to completely eliminate all these alternatives. What we want to say is that design is better than unguided processes. We don't have to eliminate the alternatives to do that. Well, let me go on. That's the literature on that point. There's a lot of very technical literature on that, and if you're interested in that kind of thing, well worth pursuing. And right at the heart of modern statistics and probability, by the way, I should add. So definitely worth looking into. Compatibility with Darwinian evolution. Well, there's been quite a bit of discussion about this topic, especially in light of Alvin Plantinga's remarks that there isn't necessarily incompatibility. Well, what about those random mutations I talked about earlier? Whether they were incompatible with guidance. Well, I've argued that they're not, but that still leaves a question. Why do so many evolutionists, atheistic evolutionists I might add, why do so many of them think that it is incompatible? If Plantinga's right. Well, I would suggest that the answer here is because they think that evolution explains away design. Not because it's sort of logically incompatible, but because it explains away design. There's just no longer any need for design. Except I've argued that it doesn't explain away design. Design is part of science. Well, the biological design argument that I've been referring to doesn't require this. It isn't being proposed as a rival scientific explanation, although it is compatible with other scientific explanations. If there are other evolutionary mechanisms or whatever that are brought into the picture, then the argument that I'm proposing is compatible with those. I think the argument that I'm proposing is more philosophical in nature. It's a bit more like the fine-tuning argument. I mean, why, for example, does the fine-tuning argument not cause so much consternation amongst scientists? Well, I think one reason for this is because it's not proposed as a rival scientific explanation to anything. I think that is one of the key differences. Okay, one further difference then, silence and the identity of the designer. Well, the biological design argument that I'm very, very briefly sketching here could go either way on this, but I think arguably it's most plausibly construed as part of an overall case for theism. And I think this fits in with the sort of thing that Steve Fuller was saying earlier on today. And if this is the case, then I think what we need to do is argue that God would have some reason to bring about humans or intelligent life, reasons for bringing about an embodied moral agents. This is a sort of approach that Richard Swinburne, for example, takes in arguing for design. Well, those are four differences. I should say that these are differences, and to what extent these are essential to ID is for others, I suppose, to discuss and decide. So let me finish off by looking at a question that is of a lot of interest to me, and from speaking to some people today, I think of interest to a lot of others as well. Apologetics or science. I am very interested in Christian apologetics, and I know many others are too. Now, what I am proposing is that if apologetics is the goal, then the biological design argument has some advantages. It separates debates about design from philosophical debates about the nature of science. It focuses on the case for design rather than tying it to a rejection of Darwinian evolution. And thirdly, if it's not silent about the designer, it offers an argument for the existence of God, which again, intelligent design, at least the most prominent view in the literature, is that it doesn't identify who the designer is. But of course, if the goal is a new scientific theory to rival Darwinism, then the biological design argument doesn't fit the bill. So this is not an argument against intelligent design, this point, I hasten to add, because it's not proposed as Christian apologetics. So it's not a criticism of it to say that it's not the best, arguably, from that point of view, or at least that the alternative has some advantages. Well, let me draw some conclusions then. I think explaining away provides a framework for approaching a whole range of topics when it comes to debates about science and religion. The claim is often made that science has explained away God, explained away design, or whatever. And I think this way of approaching the question enables us to respond by saying that explaining away is no trivial matter. You can't just propose some scientific theory and say, there you go, no longer any need for God. So I think this is the most important point of what I want to say. But secondly, it's far from clear that Darwinism explains away design for the reasons I've outlined. Furthermore, a biological design argument, which I've only sketched, but it seems to me that there's a very plausible argument here. And finally, the argument, this biological design argument, differs from ID. But a suggestion here is that it could be embraced as a core design argument by both ID proponents and theistic evolutionists. They will, of course, part their ways, no doubt, afterwards. But there's nothing here that I think either side couldn't sign up to. And indeed, one of the concerns I have is that from a theistic evolutionary point of view, many theistic evolutionists reject the idea of there being evidence for design in biology. And this is something I don't quite understand. It seems to me that there's a very plausible case for design in biology. So I think there's some room for common ground on that front. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting paper, Dr. Glass. And once again, we invite comments and questions from the audience. This gentleman.
Thanks for your talk, David, first of all. It's very interesting indeed. But as a statistician, I have some worries. Bayes' theorem is a theorem, it's true. But the way Bayes' theorem is often applied is really a way of dignifying guesswork. And I think you have to make a number of subjective decisions about what your probabilities might be. And I just wonder, have you done a sensitivity analysis? How finely tuned do they have to be?
Thank you. Excellent question. I think this is a very relevant point about the use of Bayes' theorem. One of the points that I do want to stress is that I don't think we can put in actual values here for these probabilities. We do have to estimate them. that can be informed by the best scientific evidence we have, and should be informed by the best scientific evidence we have. And that's whether we're trying to account for the origin of life or whatever it happens to be. But there will be uncertainty about these values. And I think when you talk about the sensitivity analysis, I think that's very important, because I think what we want to do is make some plausible assumptions, but then we want to see, well, how much does the argument depend on those assumptions? If it turns out, for example, that the origin of life is extremely improbable, and I think there's a strong case for this, based on certainly all our current theories regarding the origin of life, and that this is extremely improbable, then the other probabilities that we put in here, there can be quite a bit of flexibility. I think the argument will still work. So I kind of agree with you about that there is some guesswork, but I wouldn't be so skeptical. I think it's still possible to make a plausible case. The whole point of using Bayes' theorem, I would say here, is to structure our reasoning, not to use it as a precise mathematical tool. And this is the kind of thing that Richard Swinburne does in terms of the existence of God. But let me also make a point here as well in terms of the filter approach. William Dembski has done a lot of very interesting work in trying to come up with an approach for eliminating chance processes. But I think there are questions there as well about exactly how you define your rejection regions, exactly how you define the probabilities and forth. There's a lot of estimation. Again, in terms of the probability of complex structures informed by science, but I think there's a level of subjectivity in that approach as well. But thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk. I thought it was very, how should we say, very candid in what you were attempting to do. And I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. Because the providing a biological design argument is done largely for the sake of Christian apologetics, I take it. Now, maybe this is a general point you can address with regard to the relationship between Christian apologetics and scientific research. But the way you've sort of defined the biological design argument, from a scientific standpoint, it doesn't look like much more than an intellectual holding pattern. Okay, in the sense that it kind of keeps a lot of questions open, but it keeps the compatibility where it needs to be between the science and the theology. And I'm just wondering, is there any payoff at all from holding this biological design argument for science? I can understand the value it serves as far as Christian apologetics is concerned, and I understand why it's an improvement over the way in which theistic evolution tends to be presented, so I take that point too. But I'm wondering, is there a payoff for science here?
So the question is there a payoff for
scientific research?
Yes.
We understand that it has payoff for Christian apologetics, and so I see that completely, but is there a payoff for science?
Yeah, thank you again for that. In terms of payoff, you're right that the primary motivation here is in terms of an apologetic argument, and it's the same as other design arguments that would be offered. So that's certainly the main focus. Is there a payoff for science? That's not so clear. Not in a direct sense, I would say. I'm not proposing this as a rival scientific theory. Nevertheless, I don't want to have this sharp distinction between science and philosophy. I don't think you do either.
No, that's right. That's why I'm asking. Yes.
So I think that there may be indirect linkages here. So take, for example, the fine-tuning argument in physics. The fine-tuning argument doesn't offer a new rival scientific theory. Nevertheless, this is very intriguing about the nature of the universe we live in, and it informs our thinking about the nature of the universe.
But let me just say, one thing to say about the fine-tuning argument is that there are physicists, often people who one might regard as being sort of on the fringe of the discipline, who are trying to embed the fine-tuning argument in a kind of new cosmology, essentially, right? So in other words, they're trying to make that as part of an alternative physical theory, in a sense. And I'm struck by this because, in your criticism of ID, right, in a sense, this is your criticism of ID. The ID needs to be an alternative theory, not just something that is the result of eliminating alternatives. And in a sense, it seems this is the spirit in which you're really criticizing Dembski, right? And so I was wondering, okay, that's a great criticism of ID. I take it on board entirely, but then your own project doesn't seem to really involve this.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, that's a very good point. I think there's a difference here in that the idea of ID is to propose an alternative scientific theory. I'm not claiming that, at least as a core position. Now, it's an interesting question. Could someone then build on that core position to try to inform scientific research? It's an interesting idea. It's not one that I've given much thought to. But yeah, maybe one to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here.
You, sir. Here you go.
Yeah, I think W.R. Thomson, for instance, in his introduction to the Everyman's addition to the theory, to Darwin's theory of evolution, actually suggested that evolution was deleterious to the advance of science. And therefore, this probably has got, in his view at any rate, intelligent design would have a positive contribution to science. The other thing that I wanted to mention was, do we consider study of natural languages as a study of nature? Because if we do, then there's an enormous amount of, again, further statistical evidence for intelligent design. Yeah.
So the questions are a two-part question. Yeah.
Yeah. So to take the second one about language and statistical evidence from language relating to intelligent design, I don't know the truth about that. Yeah, I mean, there certainly might well be potential there. I don't know enough about that area to claim that there would be a strong case for an intelligent design argument there. It's an interesting thought. Your first point about the design having a positive influence in biology, I think, again, in relation to the previous question, that's entirely possible. I mean, I don't think that offering a design argument in any way undermines science. And indeed, I think when we look at the history of science, as Steve Fuller has pointed out this morning again, when we look at the history of science, we see that its foundations are from a theistic perspective. And so I suppose what I'm trying to do is say that keeping that tradition going is a very good thing, and that will hopefully inform, albeit in an indirect way, scientific practice as well.
Yep. A further question?
I mean, where is the evidence that chance processes build anything? I mean, surely the only real evidence that we're all sitting here together as a room full of living accidents is the non-existence of God. I mean, surely that's really the real proof that we are a room full of living accidents, is the non-existence of God. If God existed, we wouldn't need to hypothesize that we're all accidents. We wouldn't need to try to get around the discontinuous nature of the fossil record, the punctuated equilibrium. We wouldn't need to explain that away, because we would permit the existence of the supernatural in our understanding of reality.
Thank you. So we would need the supernatural in our understanding of reality, that we're not the result of accidents. Again, I agree with that. I mean, I agree that we're not accidents. I mean, and this is my concern, that an evolutionary viewpoint, that once Dawkins and various other people make a further extrapolation beyond that to tell us that we are accidents, that we've come about as a result of a purposeless process. Well, I think this is just going beyond science. It's going beyond what Darwinism, I mean, even if we accept everything about Darwinism, this is still going beyond what it can tell us. So I think there's a further perspective on this, which is a design perspective in the context of a sort of biological design argument that I've been proposing.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to be the first one to use the term God of the gaps at this conference. I apologise for that. But it just strikes me that perhaps your BDA approach is more vulnerable to the charge of God of the gaps than intelligent design is, because whereas ideas, it's commonly understood, is at the very least saying that the gaps are much bigger than people tend to think, and that they're perhaps even growing as our scientific knowledge advances and perhaps even becoming better defined. It seems to me that you're allowing Richard Dawkins to define what the gaps are, for example, consciousness, eukaryotic cell, and you're just working on the gaps that he identifies, and they're very likely to shrink if he's the one defining them. So is your view more vulnerable to that charge of God of the gaps than ideas?
So the question is, is the God of the gaps assuming too much prominence?
I don't think so. It's an interesting take that it's more vulnerable to it than intelligent design. Let me just make a point about intelligent design here. Insofar as I've identified a number of differences between the biological design argument and intelligent design, I think there's a question there as to how essential these different components are to intelligent design. And again, I leave that open to others to decide. But let me also point out that whilst I have raised some criticisms about the filter, for example, I think there are a lot of criticisms of intelligent design that I think are hopeless. I think, for example, the arguments about methodological naturalism, I think they all fail. I mean, they're just pretty poor arguments. I mean, I think there's different ends of a spectrum going from a more scientific to a more philosophical end and so forth. But I think there's a lot of poor arguments. The God of the gaps, I don't know. I don't think it's a great objection anyway. But let me take it in terms of the design argument that I've been proposing. What kind of gaps would constitute a problem for an explanation of the sort that I'm giving? Well, I think if we have a causal chain where we know each step along the way of this causal chain, but there is just one gap in our sort of physical mechanism here, and we bring in God to plug that one gap, then I'm sympathetic to there being a God of the gaps problem there. That's not to say that there aren't any gaps, it's just to say that that might be a bit questionable. But let's suppose that we have good reason from diverse sources of evidence and information on the basis of all our understanding of science that there are some things that are sort of fundamentally inexplicable in terms of materialism. One example of this is in terms of the mind, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about this today. So in the discussion of the mind, a philosopher who's not a theist, David Chalmers, talks about an explanatory gap. Now, he doesn't think there's any causal gap, nothing like the sort of scenario I just described, but he thinks there's an explanatory gap. And he's not appealing to God, but there's an explanatory gap. Now, that's roughly what I'm saying here. I'm not appealing to particular gaps at stages. I'm just using Richard Dawkins to sort of illustrate the low probability aspect of this. How God did it, does it require causal gaps? I don't think it requires that at all. But I think there is a gap in terms of explanation. Thank you.
David, we've not met, but I thought that was a very insightful, nuanced paper. And I think it's very important for the advance of the ID research program to have the kind of deep analysis of explanations as part of the things at the interface between science and philosophy. There's an active conversation going on about how you best cash out design inferences. And I personally, I had a chapter in my book called All Roads Lead to Rome, and I wasn't talking about Protestant Catholic things. They were just that you could be a Bayesian, you could be a Fisherian. Inference to the best explanation, I think, is a model fits with either of those probabilistic models. We have Bayesian friends in the States at University of Michigan who like the IBE approach to design but don't like Dembski, and we've been all been together. In Dembski's defense, I just wanted to clarify that explain that he has clarified that this eliminative approach was meant as a kind of rational reconstruction, and that he didn't mean it to imply that there's a priority first on chance, then on necessity, and only once those are completely and absolutely eliminated, then you can infer design. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about your approach today is the way in which you, in a sense, put the burden of proof in the right place by emphasizing that the appearance of design and the complexity or the information or whatever it is something that the other side bears a burden to explain away, and that these weak attempts at that are not really, just because they have a possible explanation is not equivalent to the best explanation. And so I think that's all very good, and especially I like the way you cashed out on the fine-tuning. There's one cautionary note I would strike as to this question of the extent to which neo-Darwinism is compatible with design. And it has to do with the way in which two things: the way in which the neo-Darwinists themselves understand their own project of explanation, and secondly, the way in which the repudiation or denial of design is hard baked into the logic of the argument in The Origin of Species right in chapter 3. It's not so much the random element that gets rid of design in the neo-Darwinian thinking. It's the way in which natural selection is argued to be able to explain away the appearance of design, to eliminate the need for intelligence. And we could argue about whether, if you break natural selection down to non-random death, whether maybe God set up a system where non-random death achieved his purposes. But in the Darwinian understanding of their own theory, what they're saying is that it's crucial. It was crucial to the argument in The Origin in chapter 3 that the process that Darwin described as natural selection could explain the appearance of design, in particular adaptation, without invoking an intelligence, so that he had a mechanism that was undirected that could do what a designing agent can do. Now, you could smuggle in intelligence behind that after all and say, well, we've got the appearance of design that's explained away by an undirected, unguided mechanism, which is actually surreptitiously guided behind the scenes. But then you get into kind of epicycles of explanation. And our point in the ID movement has been, if that's what the TEs want to do, they should just do it much more simply and say that it looks designed because it really is designed. So the unguided nature of evolution, I think there is a sense in which it's hard baked into the argument in The Origin, and that it's not the random aspect, it's the role that natural selection plays as opposed to artificial selection. But otherwise, I love the paper, very interesting stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you for your generous comments. Let me just comment very briefly on that in terms of the Bayesian / Fisherian sort of approach. All I can say is I'm glad to hear that. It seems to me something like inference to the best explanation, and I know this is something you've looked at, seems like a plausible way to go here. My suggestion would be that is best cashed out in terms of a Bayesian account rather than a limitative Fisherian account. But anyway, that's another opinion.
I see things the way you're presenting things that could enhance the account that I've given of this. Lipton's approach was to give a causal, contrasted account of best explanation that didn't require these probability calculations. But I think it can be done in multiple ways, and there may be more than one model of reasoning that can lead to the design conclusion. That there may be different rational reconstructions of how we reason to design that give an adequate account, and very sympathetic to the Bayesian one that you've offered. So,
okay. Thank you. On the other point about neo-Darwinism, in terms of the historical background to that may well be the point. I'm not making a claim about the history of this. Just looking at it from our perspective today, is it incompatible with the guided process? Certainly many neo-Darwinians, that's exactly what they say. But I think when we look at theistic evolutionists, they don't want to put it in those terms. They do want to say this is compatible with being guided, but not, I think, with evidence for design. But going back, I mean, even to Darwin's case in The Origin, I think the point that you're making, if I understand it correctly, is that it's the fact that we have this alternative explanation, undirected explanation that accounts for the evidence that makes it incompatible. But that's the explaining away mechanism. It's no logical incompatibility. It's the fact that it's supposed to explain away design that gives rise to the belief that it's incompatible.
And you're saying that the primacy of the observation of design, the appearance of design, even that neo-Darwinists acknowledge, should take preeminence or prominence in our explanatory schemes. Yeah, I like that.
Just a comment and a quick question. There's a line that the greatest impediment to advance of knowledge is not ignorance, but the assumption that one already knows the answers. And from that point of view, of course, this question about what is the role of the design argument in relation to science, it is precisely that because the Darwinian evolutionary story is all explanatory, and its ability to raise questions about that all those things that has all those profound questions that evolution gloss over, that it is really important
I understand it, a tool for the advancement of science, because it accepts that there is ignorance about these questions, and that is the beginning of knowledge and so on. My point is that there's a much more powerful negative argument against the design argument in people's common perceptions. And that is that in everyday sort of commonsensical perception of this argument, the real problem that one up against is the whole question of agency and how does this phenomenon of design happen. And that, that seems to me to be, no matter how plausible the Bayesian argument might be, that is the overriding consideration in people's commonsensical view.
Thank you. So this question of agency, I guess this is really a question about, if we're going to appeal to design, we have to say about how the designer does it. Well, let me make two comments about that. First of all, in terms of inferring design, in terms of the logic of the design argument that I'm presenting, I don't think that's required. I don't think we need to be able to say how the designer did it. And I think when we look at design in other contexts, to take Paley's sort of argument about the watch or whatever, I mean, everybody's agreed that when we're talking about watches, we can infer design, but that doesn't require knowing the mechanism by which the watch was produced, whether it was factory produced, hand produced, whatever. But of course, it still leaves a question, well, how was it produced? And so with the design argument that I'm referring to here, in the case of biology, you're right, this still leaves a question. How did it happen historically? What's the sort of sequence of events and so forth? I don't know. It's a great research question. And so nothing that I'm saying here about a biological design argument in any way undermines the importance of engaging in that kind of work. I think the design argument could be compatible with various accounts as to how that might have happened. So yeah, it's a very good question for pursuing. Thank you.
I think we'll have to draw the discussion to an end there, and I'd like to thank David very much for